Computer. Okay, so hey everybody. I'm Jennifer Sandoval, and today I'm going to be talking to you about psychology as the discipline of interiority, or we like to call it PDI for short, although there's a little controversy about doing that, but that'll be a different lecture. Um, anyway, I know that I have only got about an hour, which is probably all you can handle anyway. So I'm just going to cover a few topics. Um, and I will say at the outset, I really think you should just read it yourself instead of hearing it from me. Um, I think it's really important to read Giegerick directly and make of it what you will. Um, but as for myself, I had read a lot of Jung and then a lot of Hillman. And a friend of mine said, "Hey, you should check out this Giger guy. He's kind of interesting." And I happened to pick up uh, one of his collected works. I think it's called Neurosis. I should really know that. I'll edit this. um, anyway, I was reading the introduction to it, and it just hit me like a ton of bricks. I just was like, "This guy's amazing." And so I was sort of hooked. And then I think I read his essay on the leap after the throw about projection and his take on projection. That really got me. And then I just could not get enough of this guy. So he'll resonate with some of you and others he won't. But I definitely think if you're interested in depth psychology, if you're moved by Jung and you love Hillman, you will definitely like Giegerick. So, oh, that's so funny how it's spelling Giegerick in the closed captions. Anyway, okay, so let's try this. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So, I really don't know how to be able to read the author notes at the same time as do the presentation. Um, and I'm just going to read so you guys can see what I'm reading um, as we go through the presentation, which might be actually kind of helpful. So, Psychology is the Discipline of Interiority, Introducing the Fundamentals, Part 1. I do intend to create more videos where I'll cover other fundamental aspects of PDI, at least my take or my interpretation of these ideas. So Jungian scholar Wolfgang Giegerick defines modern psychology as the discipline of interiority. So why the Ouroboros? Um, this is really between this and the Owl of Minerva. These two symbols really are quite common um, throughout the PDI sort of community, and just they really do symbolize some of the kind of the thematically what PDI is all about. So the Ouroboros is based on Jung's insight that psychology is the only field of study that cannot take an objective view of itself. Unlike the empirical sciences, it has no Archimedean point outside of itself from which to observe itself. It must use its own concepts to understand itself, its own language to speak about itself. So, if we imagine psychology as a ship at sea, it has no dry dock on which to build itself. No, it has to build itself while out on the water. Greg Mogensen writes, whereas actual sailing vessels are built in shipyards, only subsequently to be launched into the sea, psychology, in the sense of psychology as the discipline of interiority, is different. The ship that it is has to build itself at sea from what looms up or bobs up from behind the scenes of whatever the matter of interest may be that it finds itself submerged in on each interpretive occasion. Or as Giegerick expressing this sink or swim, or better, sink and swim dialectic puts it, there is no outside anchorage where psychology could make fast. Psychology has only its own inside. It is only as its unconditional self-abandonment to its own internal bottomless sea. Ships float on the ocean that is all around them. Psychology has to be a ship too, and allow itself to be carried by what it knows not, to be a solid ground to stand on, but an unstable element, weak as water. The difference to literal sea vessels is that the ship called psychology has the ocean it floats on inside itself as the inner infinity and negativity of its own notion. This is how crazy things are in psychology. Okay, there you have it. So, what is soul? The importance of soul in psychology. The first thing to understand about Giegerick's work is how unabashed he is about the importance of soul in psychology. For him, to construe a psychology without soul is as absurd as would be a biology that had given up the notion of life. Paradoxically, between Jung, Hillman, and Giegerick, Giegerick frames soul as the most elusive to us. We glean its ethereal existence only from the residue it leaves behind in the substantive form of art, poetry, music, literature, history, and soul events. Soul exists only as absence, its form the formlessness of absolute negativity. In the same way, we might say that God has to be experienced negatively. God cannot be perceived or imagined. Even genuine visions of God are not a positive seeing or imagining. They are negations of such seeing, sublated perception. What is soul? Giegerick wrote an entire book trying to address this question. Soul is not an object, entity, or inner substance that can be directly described. Soul does not belong to natural life. It marks a different movement or level, distinct from thoughts, feelings, and even experiences as such. Arguably, the most important quality of soul in modernity is its absence. The soul does not exist as something present or given and must not be positivized in our thinking. It does not exist, but this does not at all mean that it is simply nothing. The soul is generated ever anew. Where it does not stir, where it does not produce, there simply is no soul. It exists only in its activity, in thinking, feeling, imagining, and creating. Hillman used to say, the soul is the path made by walking, which is how he described soul making. In the soul, the dance as logical negativity has truly come home to itself. It is really just a dance with no dancers, nothing but a dance. It is and stays logically negative, exclusively negative, not even metastable. Okay. The psychological difference within and out of the dance, as which natural life is, all of a sudden and out of the blue, another dance commences, the life of the soul. Okay, I want you to look at this picture here and tell me what you think is happening. Okay, so it is a little distressing to see what is going on in this fellow's head. Um, you can see he's got like bills coming out in the mail, coming through the door. Um, it's just music, socks that don't match. He's in the car upset with his dog. I don't know if you can see this. It's cute. It looks like a relationship is maybe on his mind. It's just a lot. Okay. And then we contrast that with the peaceful scene of the dog. Just sort of hanging out. And, I would think, honestly, there probably should be like a squirrel in there or something. But basically, it's just what you might imagine the dog, which is just, it's just chilling. It's just being. Okay. So, what is happening psychologically here is complete and utter ego identification. Okay. The mind is full and overdetermined. It's crowded with contents. It's not just stress, it is consciousness immersed in its contents with no distance and no difference. The contents of the mind are of utmost meaning and significant. In other words, I am completely identified with them. I cannot see beyond them. There is nothing else. That's what this is like. Okay, so now what do we have here? If only, right? If only I could be as serene as my little companion, my pet companion. So this is really the fantasy, right? Like this is what we sort of hope for. It's like I'm going to go to therapy so that I can have this in my head instead of that insanity. So this is truly the ego's fantasy. So this is actually, psychologically speaking, the neurotic scene, even more neurotic, at least according to Giegerick, than the first scene. Um, so image two, the fantasy solution. The human imagines peace equaling emptiness. What a relief. A relief is imagined as the absence of content. Why can't I just be like my dog in the here and now? Actually, it's not a bad idea. So we'll get to that later. The problem, however, is that we are still on the same logical level as the first image. So with the first image, we're here, and the second image, it's just like not here, but it's still in the same logic. Um, my mind is full and in the first image, and now it is not full. So it's what we call a simple negation. Um, this is not a psychological solution, however. It really is the ego's solution. The ego imagines a state of pure, undisturbed being, in this case, an ideal of no contradiction, no negativity, and no disturbance. Now, the topic of neurosis will be discussed in a later video, and Giegerick has written an entire book totally devoted to that topic, and it's an amazing book. I highly recommend it. It's different than the collected volume that also has neurosis in the title. But there is a book that is strictly dedicated to the topic of neurosis. And in that, in Giegerick's formulation of neurosis, this image here reflects the ego's neurotic attempt to establish an absolute, in this case, a state of pure, undisturbed bliss. It is neurotic because it is denying or resisting its own truth. This is what, for Giegrick, the sick soul does. So there's an aspect of the soul that is actually sick or neurotic, according to Giegrick. And all that really means is it's the aspect of the soul that resists its own truth. It goes against itself. That's what that means. Simply put, the second image shows the ego's attempt to establish a reality different from the one that it is in. And in this sense, it is neurotic because it reflects a wish for a different reality, a refusal of what is, an attempt to replace it with an ideal. The sickness is not the presence of suffering, but the refusal of the truth of the situation, along with the attempt to replace it with an ideal or an absolute. Soul consciousness does not wish for a different reality. Soul appears when the situation is merely recognized in its truth. So let's go to image number 3. Okay, so this is what we would call the psychological perspective, where one is objectively aware of the self or the ego. So what is happening here? Notice how we stepped backwards, so to speak, and broadened our horizon of seeing. The mind is no longer identical to the ego and to its thoughts. Rather, it is able to notice it objectively and from a distance. Consciousness is no longer trapped in the first image or logic, nor is it intent on escape via the simple negation. It instead can access a much broader awareness of itself as merely a figure in a scene, as just a person like any other, experiencing the challenges of living. Consciousness is no longer resisting what is happening, but is rather in relation to it. This expanded psychological awareness is an example of the dialectic. Psychology only happens when it becomes conscious of itself. Okay. So, the psychological difference is one of my favorite topics. um, and probably won't go too in depth here, but it is a very, very important aspect of PDI. And simply put, the psychological difference is the distinction between the ego and the soul. On the one hand, the ego, there is psychic life, thoughts, feelings, experiences, biology, and personal history. Psychic life concerns me, the subjective psyche. Basically, it's my self-concept, like who I think I am, my narrative of myself, my self-image. This is on the ego side. On the other hand, there is psychological life, as distinct from psychic life. The life of the soul, or the question of what something is in its truth. The recognition of soul occurs as the emergence of the I as a psychological function, the objective psyche. So this is, we're looking at the objective I versus the subjective me when we're looking at this difference. Okay, in psychotherapy, if the psychological difference is not maintained, the ego is simply reinforced. Even the part of the self that tries to distinguish itself from the ego is still ego. So what appears as insight or awareness can actually be a more refined version of the same structure. This reminds me actually of something Hillman used to say. Um, he said that, like when you're you're in the midst of this like intense therapeutic session and like you're the patient is relating a dream and the therapist is interpreting the dream and the patient's like wow and has the light bulb go off and it's exciting and it's like a new awareness and afterwards everyone feels good and he said Hillman said that's actually not a good thing. That's actually the ego gets to feel good. And he said, actually, you really make progress when instead of the light bulb going off, what happens is you get an experience of, oh shit. So that when you have that experience in therapy of like, oh shit, that means something really important happened. And it was in PDI parlance, a true negation happens. And that is a dislodging of oneself from the ego identity. And it does not feel good to the ego. Um, Okay, anyway, so when the ego, in its blindness, stumbles over something, even if it should be in fact the soul, it only finds more ego, but not soul. In other words, the ego cannot even recognize the soul. It can't see beyond itself. To step beyond this requires more than distancing from the ego. It requires the negation of the very sense of oneself. And this is difficult and often understandably resisted. And unfortunately, or not, suffering is the best motivation for this. And, there is a saying that those who truly wake up are those who truly suffer. And so, again, suffering can be quite the gift. Okay. The ego's unending search. Modern psychological striving, be it self-development, self-actualization, or the search for meaning, even, often remains within the sphere of the ego. It seeks gain, fulfillment, or validation. In this sense, the wish for meaning can itself be understood as a wish for self-gratification, a desire for the situation to be other than it is. The ego's movement is outward and external, toward improvement, resolution, or transcendence. It does not remain with the situation, but attempts to resist or replace it. One thing we say is that the ego, by definition, is always at war with the present moment. It's either pushing on it or pulling on it. It is, but its calling card is the idea that it should be different than it is right now. Better, different, something has to change. That it cannot find its fulfillment in just being here now. Okay, so interiorization. Psychology at its heart is concerned with interiority and truth. Psychology begins where any phenomenon, whether physical or mental, real or fantasy image, is absolute negatively interiorized into itself, and I find myself in its internal infinity, writes Giegrick. This is what it takes. Psychology cannot be had for less. Interiority does not mean turning inward into subjective experience. It is not the exploration of inner states, feelings, or personal depth. Rather, interiority refers to the inner truth of the phenomenon itself, what the situation is, logically. It is not located inside the person, but in the being of the situation. As Giegrick writes, the soul is not the inwardness in man, but inwardness in itself, absolute interiority. Interiorization requires a negation of externality as such, the impulse to look elsewhere, to seek something more, even if it's other ideas, other concepts. Even when we think about, dream interpretation, sometimes we're like, oh, let's look at the book of symbols. Let's see what it means. That is not, you're going in the wrong direction according to what interiorization would ask for. Nothing is added or changed. Rather, the situation is allowed to become what it actually is. In this sense, the psychological task is to patiently linger with until its truth becomes visible. Okay, so let's talk about negation and distinguish between simple versus absolute negation. So, with a simple negation, when a contradiction appears, the response is to change or remove the content. The underlying framework remains intact. And we say that this is a movement at the semantic level, the semantic or ego or psychic level. Something is wrong, let's fix or replace it or tweak it. But you're still in the same logic of the original position. With absolute negation, the contradiction is not resolved or escaped. Rather, it reveals the limits of the position itself, or it reveals the limits of its own logic. What is negated with absolute negation is the framework or logic in which the problem appeared. Here we see a shift at the logical or syntactic level. And you're noticing this vocabulary of PDI where, semantic is the psychic level, syntactic is the soul level. You'll notice there's also a lot of use of vertical for soul and horizontal for ego. So horizontality is the psychic level and verticality is the soul level. And you'll get used to this as you read it. But with absolute negation, we're not going to actually, it doesn't result in a new content. The transformative revelation is the underlying truth that's revealed. So it is transformative, but it is transformative because we actually get new information, completely new information that we had not seen before. But it was information that was always there. It just had not been recognized until the absolute negation. So in the comments I have, simple negation is rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Absolute negation is recognizing that one is the ocean. So it's like a completely different logic. Dialectics. In his writings, Giegrick frequently distinguishes between the semantic or content level of consciousness and the syntactic level of its overall structure or form. So content versus form. Change at the semantic level merely involves a shifting around of the contents of consciousness in the light of their having been contradicted in some way. This shifting around, however, as extensive as it may be in many cases, poses no challenge to the form of consciousness. None of its contents, that is to say, has yet become the straw that breaks the camel's back. In the negation of the negation, by contrast, The camel's back is broken, the structure of consciousness torn asunder. That's from Greg Mogensen. Okay, now I'd like to share some examples of the dialectic so that you can get a sense of what it feels like and what it looks like in practice. So this story of the priest was shared with me by a good friend. So a priest visits a hospital room to offer Holy Communion to a very ill patient. When he opens the door, he sees the dying woman on the bed, surrounded by family and friends, tenderly holding her and singing to her. As he enters the room, it dawns on him that though he initially thought he was there to give communion, he was in fact receiving it by entering their midst. The priest's realization is an example of consciousness elevated to the vertical or psychological dimension. The priest perceives or recognizes the inner truth of the meaning of Holy Communion. His comprehension of the notion is absolved from its literal definitional constraints, for example, the breaking of bread, and released into its infinite truth as a living expression of logical love. Communion as a living, embodied act of remembrance and recognition of the soul returning to itself as love. Okay, our next example. An experienced therapist witnesses a young patient suffering in agonizing grief over the loss of her pregnancy. The therapist notices in herself an unfamiliar emotional distance from her patient's suffering. It occurs to her that she herself may have been fooling herself her entire adult life regarding her decision not to have children. A decision with which she thought she had long ago made peace. She brings up the question in supervision and immediately feels an overwhelming sense of sorrow and loss, which allows her to finally connect with her patient's experience. Her supervisor then asks a different version of her question. Is it possible the therapist may have been fooling herself all these years, period? Was she in fact fooling herself all the time, including this moment? The supervisor's ultimate question, distilled and absolved of the particulars, for example, the reference to having children and the specific duration of an adult life, is an example of consciousness elevated to the vertical or psychological level. The therapist made way for the possibility by posing the initial question that negated a fundamental aspect of her self-concept or her ego. However, the negation was a simple one, remaining on the local level, constrained by her personal experience and decision. The supervisor's question, by absolving the question of its particulars, it is no longer about children or parenthood, induces an absolute negation. The entire foundation of the therapist's self-understanding is seen through. In fact, it becomes defined by fooling herself and reveals an inherent condition or aspect of truth about the unconsciousness of consciousness or the personal ego. In the biblical story of the prodigal son, this is our next example. In the biblical story of the prodigal son, a young man leaves his home and squanders the treasure his father gave him for nothing of any value. He is ashamed to return to his father because he believes he has hurt him. But when he finally does return, his father welcomes him with joy because the son himself was his father's treasure. His father wanted nothing else. Here we note the dimensional upgrade from semantics to syntax, from content to form, from having literal treasure to being spiritual treasure in its true sense as love or being, achieved through the negation, squandering of not only the literal treasure, but of the son's value of himself. I have treasure, I am worthy. That's the initial position. I lose treasure, I am worthless. That is the negation of the original position, which gives way completely. That logic is absolutely negated in the recognition that my true treasure is my Father, for whom I discover I am his treasure also. And our last example is from Ibram X. Kendi, who offers another example of the dialectic in the context of racism. He begins by describing the initial position, position A, of the racist as one who harbors racist ideas. A racist idea is any idea that suggests one racial group is inferior or superior to another racial group in any way. Racist ideas argue that the inferiorities and superiorities of racial groups explain racial inequities in society. Upon further reflection and awareness, however, the negated position is preferable, namely the relinquishment of the idea of discrimination based on race. One might then declare themselves to be a non-racist or race neutral. However, to merely deny that one is racist is to stay on the same logical level or reality of the racist. So here we see the simple negation does not logically hold up. What is needed is an absolute negation, which results in the notion of anti-racism. An anti-racist idea is any idea that suggests the racial groups are equals in all their apparent differences, that there is nothing right or wrong with any racial group. Anti-racist ideas argue that racist policies are the cause of racial inequities. The dialectic involves the absolute negation of the logical form of the content from within itself, which arrives back at the starting point, albeit a transformed starting point. In Kendi's example, anti-racism allows for the original idea of discrimination in an objective sense, wherein if discrimination is creating equity, then it is anti-racist. If discrimination is creating inequity, then it is racist. Furthermore, the only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. And in order to treat some persons equally, we must treat them differently. That's from Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Okay, so part 3, the psychological I. In the deepest sense, we exist not as organism, but as soul, or Geist, which is the German term for psyche. The psychological I is the standpoint of true psychology, the discipline of a soulful approach or reaction to phenomena, in contrast to a soulless, technical, cynical, rationalistic, merely pragmatic approach, in contrast to egoic emotionality, sentimentality, nostalgia, as well as in contrast to an ideology-ridden theory, a subjective wish, need, and quest-driven view of things. Psychology is not in quest of anything. It does not want anything. Inasmuch as the psychological I is the standpoint of true psychology, it is not my I, but an objective I. It's psychology's I, or psychology as the I. This is a very important point. I am a psychologist to the extent that psychology, its methodological frame of mind, is at work in me. Psychology has to be the subject that is doing the psychologist's seeing, thinking, and feeling, not he or she themselves. Only if psychology is the truly active subject in us is there a possibility that soul making and awareness or recognition of soul can happen, because only like can know and produce like. That is from What is Soul? So now I would like to share a brief video clip, and I hope this works. Let's see. So this is of Joseph Campbell. I don't know if any of you are old enough to appreciate Joseph Campbell, but gosh, back in the early 90s, I think, or late 80s, I don't remember, he had a wonderful set of interviews with Bill Moyers and about his books and his scholarship on myths. So it's really wonderful to watch. But here's just a very short clip as it relates to the psychological I. Let's see if this works. I hope you can hear this.
The middle life, when the body has reached its climax of power and begins to lose it, is to identify yourself, not with the body which is falling away, but with the consciousness of which it is a vehicle. And when you can do that, and this is something I learned from my myths, what am I? Am I the bulb that carries the light, or am I the light of which the bulb is a vehicle? And this body is a vehicle of consciousness. And if you can identify with the consciousness, you can watch this thing go like an old car. There goes the fender. There goes this. But that's expectable, you know? And then gradually, the whole thing drops off and consciousness rejoins consciousness. I mean, it's no longer in this particular environment.
Okay, how do I get back? Did you know expectable really is a word? I had to look that up. Okay. Let's see. So, the psychological I. What am I? Am I the bulb that carries the light? Or am I the light, consciousness of which the bulb is a vehicle? In the deepest sense, we exist not as organism, but as soul or Geist. You are the light. All right, there you have it. I see we're only at 45 minutes, so you get to have a break. um, I may have to cut that part out. Anyway, I hope this was of interest to you. And if you have any questions or would like me to cover anything, any other aspects of PDI, please write to me. I would love to get your questions and comments. You can either comment in the YouTube comments, or you can actually um, email me. So I will let you know my email, and you're free to, again, send questions, comments. I would love to hear from you. All right, that's it for now. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.